Texas, you just don't throw a brat on the grill. As the #1 premium smoked sausage in Texas, we know what Texans like on their table. I'm Mike Kilbasa. Give us a try, and you'll understand why we're the best in the business.
Good evening and welcome to Catholicism Live. I'm Alan Becker and I'm your host tonight, and we are great to have you here. We're continuing our series on theology of the body and focusing on sex and the contemporary culture. If you missed our last episodes, don't worry. We'll pick you right up in where we're at and we'll make you part of the show by allowing you to call in. We welcome our Channel 15 CTSA audience. Thank you for supporting Catholic television. KJMA 89.7 FM. Welcome to all the listeners out there as we stream. And you can stream us, call your friends, call the folks who are outside the San Antonio area. You can pick us up on grnonline.com. That's a Guadalupe Radio Network, grnonline, one word, .com. We want to thank the Pilgrim Center of Hope, specifically Deacon Tom and Mary Jane Fox. Welcome them back from their pilgrimage. And we were honored to be here and pray with them. And thank you to Angela and the crew that loaded up the spiritual pilgrimage on their website, www.pilgrimcenterofhope.org. We had advertised that. If you had a chance to look at that, you and I, we had a special relationship with this pilgrimage, following them every day. So thank you very much for doing that. And get on that website, pilgrimcenterofhope.org, to see what's coming up in the future and to see where they've been in their pilgrimage. But tonight, we have Dr. David Delaney from the Mexican American Catholic College. Dr. Delaney, welcome. Thanks for coming back.
Thank you, Alan. It's good to be here with you again.
Great. And if you want to find out about the Mexican American Catholic College, get on their website, maccsa.org, maccsa.org. And we are working on theology of the body from Pope John Paul II. And Dr. Delaney, you're teaching a class on theology of the body. Is that correct?
Yes, I am. It begins in the spring. Our spring semester starts January 23rd, and we're now taking registrations for that class. It can be taken either as an undergraduate or a graduate class, or if you wish, you can audit it.
Well, great. Very flexible.
Very flexible.
So
yes.
maccsa.org. Please get on there, and if you like the discussions of theology of the body, what we've taken here is sex in the contemporary culture. And if you didn't follow us, like I said the last few weeks, that's okay. We started with person, ourself. We are created in the image and likeness of God. And who are we and who we are created? We moved in second episode on how we relate as male and female. Differences, why God made us male and female, and how we took that work. And the complementarity of male and female. And if you have questions on that or anything else, you can still call. We will answer those questions too. Give us a call, 210-734-5371, and we will take your calls on those. Or last week, we got into the beauty of the church's teaching on marriage. And we'll pick up a little bit on marriage, Dr. Delaney, if we would. We focused last time on Ephesians 5.
Yes.
As a great biblical text to review and to study on how marriage goes. So let's take a couple minutes just to recap from last week what God's plan is for our marriage.
Yes.
Let's put that together.
Thank you, Alan. It's a very important insight to understand really what marriage is, the fullness of marriage, the sacramental marriage, because we have lost most of us, our society for sure, but many within the church, many Catholics have lost sight of really the meaning, the fundamental meaning of marriage. And St. Paul in Ephesians 5 shows us this meaning. ultimately, the meaning of marriage can only be found in Christ's relationship with the church, and ultimately Christ giving of himself for the sake of his church, the sake of the church's sanctification. And so when it comes to our recognition of what our obligations are when we enter our mission, our goal, as well as our obligations in marriage, we need to look to Christ in his relationship with the church. We need to look to the cross. We need to recognize the implications of that what comes out of marriage and the reason for entering into marriage is for giving oneself to the other for their own sake. Our mission, our goal in marriage is the salvation, sanctification of our spouses and our families, our children. The result of that should be, the fruit of that should be, when we do it well in a self-giving way, will be happiness. But I think we mentioned last time, when we pursue marriage as a goal, with the goal of happiness, we end up losing both. We lose the happiness and our marriage because we end up treating it as an end, that goal as an end, and so we treat our spouse as a means as opposed to, instead of serving them, we expect them to serve us, to be the source of our happiness. So we can see in this relationship some of those things. Besides being selfless, self-giving, we see that Christ had one spouse. The church, it's exclusive. You have exclusivity of one person that you have given yourself to for the period of that marriage anyway.
For the rest of your life. There's a vow for the rest of your life.
As long as you both shall live.
That's
exactly. But also, it is irrevocable. Christ has one spouse, one church, but he doesn't go from one to the next. Regardless of how unfaithful we can be, he is always faithful to his spouse. And we, therefore, must be faithful to our vow, to our spouse, to work for our spouse's salvation regardless of what may come.
Sure. You think a lot of people in contemporary today, and I've been to many Catholics and in Christian weddings, beautiful weddings, beautiful ceremonies. They invite God to the ceremony. But we have to remember that we need to invite God every day to our daily marriages. And I think the strength, and as you mentioned, be Christ-centered. And that's the difficult part, because the culture says, well, we can do it alone, we can do it ourselves, we need to have self-fulfillment, self-happiness, but that's not the key. The key is with Christ together, the three, work together to continue that marriage.
Very much so. I think you're right, Alan. And sometimes I think you're right that God may be invited to the marriage, but many times he's asked to take a seat.
Get in the back seat.
Yes, and sometimes it's too much about the bride and the groom and not enough about God first.
Right.
I think we were at a wedding ceremony not recently where the bride and the groom chose to retreat a little bit from the attention to make God the center of it. It was very refreshing.
Yes, that's very good to do that. The reflection of marriage, being as Christ is the church, and of course Ephesians 5, and there's even a website we talked about last time, I'll repeat, e5men.org.
Yes.
Isn't that great? E5Men, very easy to remember. And if you get on there, and ladies, don't worry, get on the e5men.org, and there is a link and other things for E5 women also, Ephesians 5 women. But it talks about that husbands, love your wife as Christ loved the church.
Yes.
And we know how much Christ loved the church. We look at the cross, as you had mentioned. Christ died for the church.
Yes. Greater love has no man than this, to lay down his life for his friends. That's ultimately this act of total self-gift.
Wow, and preparing for the marriage for last week, and we're going to talk about tonight, yes, this marriage is to be lifelong, this marriage is to be a commitment, this marriage is to be a covenant between, but sometimes things fall apart.
Yes.
Sometimes there are internal or external pressures that the couple cannot handle between the two. Now, it takes work. The other part of Christ didn't get to the cross in an instant.
Right.
Christ went through long suffering before he got to the cross. And sometimes marriages create suffering that we have to live through. So we'll take some of the parallels on that and look at some of that a little bit. But one of the things before we get into that, one of the things that it just blew me away when I was concentrating and meditating on this. And And it hit me as I was reading it in adoration this morning, believe it or not. The understanding of Christ self-giving to his church, to his bride, in the Eucharist.
Yes.
And he is there giving himself to us fully, his body, blood, soul, and divinity in the Eucharist. And we, on our part, are to do that and to give that and to work that as we receive the Eucharist and give that back to God. Now, I think we talk about that, we work on that, but take that and now apply that, me as a husband, to my wife.
Yes.
Wow, do I have some work to do?
Yes, we call it Holy Communion for a reason.
Right.
It's
Right.
our union with our bridegroom. And the Holy Communion that we can have with our spouses, we know that the sacramental grace coming from marriage has its efficacy from the Eucharist.
Right.
There's this direct tie. But it is in fact the case that we can have that union with our spouse, this life-giving, total self-gift of oneself, in a supernatural way only by virtue of living in that Holy Communion, that Holy
Wow.
Communion with our bridegroom.
Very good, very good. The parallels on there are just blow me away as I got that. So I wanted to bring that out.
Very good.
And of course, that's what we want to have. We want to have those marriages. We want to have those long marriages. We need to thank the people that have been married 30, 40, 50
Yes.
years. Thank you for being a role model for our society. So maybe we could make a point to that next time you see a couple being together in church and thank them for their lifelong commitment to each other, because just them being together, you can see each other, especially in older age, as they care for each other as they have their whole life. What a role model. I don't think we do
Yes.
that enough in our society. I really don't think we do.
No, you're exactly right, Alan. Witness of the truth of marriage. I mean, we witness to the gospel in the way that we live. Saint Francis of Assisi, whom we will mention a little bit
Sure.
later today, tangentially anyway, was very adamant about that. Our witness is in first, our credibility as witnesses is in first the way that we live, the way that we present ourselves.
Sure.
And so we witness to the gospel, the good news about marriage, as a gift from God, as a sacramental gift from God, in the way that we live it out. And we can be just as much of a negative witness as we can a positive witness. And so you're right, it is in each and every one of our interests. Every marriage, every valid sacramental marriage, every valid marriage, it's not just the spouses. It belongs to the entire church. It belongs to the public.
Very good. Very good. Well, that brings us kind of to today. And again, ask any questions on this or any comments you have. Area code 210-734-5371. And if you don't feel comfortable calling in, please email us. Live, L-I-V-E, just one word, 4 letters, L-I-V-E, @catholic.org. And we will answer your questions either via email or on our next show. So our topic tonight, we want to continue with marriage. I do, but for a while.
Yes.
Sometimes, and unfortunately, and of course, many people that we know in our families end up in divorce. And why?
Yeah.
The church teaches such a beautiful way and tries to prepare the way and try to work with that, but divorces happen. The church works with this term divorce, and we want to discuss that, and there's different aspects of it. But first of all, as we've done in all the episodes and need to continue, let's go to Scripture. We're going to go to Matthew chapter 19, and Jesus talks about divorce. And so the apostles came up to him, starting in 7. They said, well, then why did Moses command that a man give a woman a bill of divorce and dismiss her? And Jesus said in verse 8, we're in Matthew chapter 19, verse 8, he said to them, because of your hardness of your hearts, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. So in Pope John Paul II, his theology of the body here goes back to the beginning of Adam and Eve and the first marriage.
Exactly.
That they were the ideal marriage in the beginning, to fidelity to each other, but Moses allowed it because of the hardness of their hearts. So Jesus ratcheted up and gives us the command today. Verse 9, I say to you, whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery. Now, if you're following along, I missed a little parenthesis in the middle. It says, I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, quote, unless the marriage is unlawful, and marries another, commits adultery. So there is an exception clause here. And some people have taken that right, and some people take and misinterpret that. Let's discuss that a little bit, Dr. Lee, if you would, please. What does this mean, unless the marriage is unlawful?
Okay, that's a very good question, Alan. And it might be best to contextualize it by reading a couple more of the couple more verses.
Sure.
And from where you left off, except for, you said, an unlawful marriage.
Right.
My translation, you're using the New American,
Right.
which is one particular interpretation of it.
Right.
Mine is the Revised Standard Version. Mine says, except for unchastity, and this will be important because we will discuss why these two are different.
Okay.
Except for unchastity and marries another commits adultery, and he who marries a divorced woman commits adultery.
Right.
And then the disciples said to Jesus, if such is the case of a man with his wife, it is not expedient to marry. And Jesus responds to them, not all men can receive this precept, but only those to whom it is given. And so here what we have in context, the question is, the clause that you're referring to, except for an unlawful marriage, except for unchastity, what does that mean? Well, for the first 1,500 years of the church, there was a patristic understanding, a patristic interpretation. The fathers had looked at what was being said here. And they noticed that here, in these verses, that that Jesus was seeming to make an exception. But if you go over to Mark chapter 10, verses 1 through 12, this is pretty much the same passage, but there isn't that exception.
Well, they missed it there.
Yeah, you were reading out of Mark earlier.
Right. Yeah.
Yes, and so clearly Mark isn't wrong, and there is no exception to what he's saying. If a woman, if a man divorces his wife and marries another, he commits adultery, and he who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. You know, this is what Mark is saying, and so the fathers were saying, well, here what Matthew is saying is that, and the way that it's caveated, notice that except for unchastity is before and marries another. And so they were making this reference back to what St. Paul is saying in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 10 and 11. There, St. Paul talks about two people that separate and don't come back together.
Okay.
And in that case, he's saying that if you can't come back together, if this marriage isn't reconcilable, then you have to live apart.
Okay.
And so the early church fathers saw this as a reference to St. Paul, that in the putting of that, that parentheses before and marries another says, okay, well, you perhaps in the case of this, in the case of this porneia, which really would be, it could be. I mentioned porneia, and perhaps
Right.
I should stop here
Sure.
now.
You're getting Greek on us, David.
Yeah, yes. I had meant to save that for a little
Okay.
bit, but since I've thrown it out,
There you go.
let's pause here and explain it.
Let's go right for it.
Okay, the term here that the New American, the NAB, referred to as unlawful marriage,
Right.
that the RSV, the Revised Standard Version, refers to as unchastity.
Unchastity.
In Greek is porneia.
Okay.
That's where we get pornography.
Ah.
In general, in Greek, especially within the New Testament and even the Old Testament, this had to do with some sort of sexual sin, some sort of sexual misconduct. It could be a wide variety of things. It could mean adultery. It could mean a union, an unlawful union. And in fact, there are two places within the New Testament in which this same term, porneia, is used as an unlawful union. In Acts chapter 15, in verses 20 and 29, when this letter that is being sent by the apostles in Jerusalem, remember,
Right.
There's this first council,
First
if you
church council,
will,
yes.
and they said, the question about circumcision comes up and whether that's needed. They said, well, no, that's not necessary to come into the church. But they send off two caveats, that you're to abstain from strangled meat and from porneia, from unchastity. And that is a reference back, most scholars say, to Leviticus chapter 18, verses 6 through 18.
Mm-hmm.
And in that context, porneia in the Greek Old Testament is clearly where a marriage comes together between two that are not allowed to marry because the relationship is too close.
It's more family ties and things like that. maybe.
Exactly.
Okay.
And in 1 Corinthians 5, verses 1 through 2, St. Paul uses that same term, porneia,
Okay.
to refer to a man who has gone to or begun to live with, if you will, his father's wife,
Right.
which the implication is it's his stepmother,
Sure.
as porneia,
Right.
as an unlawful union. So this is what the RSV is interpreting porneia to be, with good reason.
So kind of wrap this up, instead of taking this and widening the exception clause, which a lot of people do, and then, this is really fairly narrow.
It's
and it really focuses a little bit on there.
right, and in that case, it would be an invalid marriage anyway.
Okay.
So
right.
it wouldn't really be a divorce.
Sure. So, okay, so that, and we can talk about that at annulments versus divorces here in a little bit, right after our break. And wow, time's going fast. Please give us a call if you have any questions or comments at 210-734-5371 or email us at live@catholic.org. This is Catholicism Live. We're going to need to take a break, and we'll be right back. Thank you.
On Tuesday, November 23rd at 2 p.m., the massive installation of Archbishop Gustavo Garcia Sier will be celebrated at St. Mark the Evangelist Church. Due to limited seating, admittance to this solemn celebration will be by invitation only. Catholic Television of San Antonio will broadcast the massive installation live thanks to the generous assistance of Time Warner Cable Television and the generosity of our underwriters of this broadcast. News 4 WOAI, Catholic Life Insurance, Bill Miller Barbecue, Catholic Community Foundation, Catholic Cemeteries, Kielbasa, Christa Santa Rosa Health Systems, IBC Bank, and Catholic Charities. Our gracious sponsors have helped to make this historic moment possible for the Archdiocese of San Antonio. The massive installation will be rebroadcast in its entirety Tuesday, November 23rd at 8 p.m. for those who cannot view it live during the day. Please keep our new shepherd in your prayers as we begin this new chapter in the faith life of our Archdiocese.
Nobody told me that 35 years of research and dozens of medical studies have shown significant complications for women who've had an abortion. Learn the facts today.
Life can challenge us with new problems that can lead to overwhelming stress. These can fracture families, separate, and keep us from having a joyful and productive life. You're not alone. Catholic Consultation Center's mission is to walk this journey with you, using good psychological practice and a spiritual Catholic foundation. Reach out now to Catholic Consultation Center. Let them help you restore hope in your life.
Welcome back. This is Catholicism Live. I'm Alan Becker, your host tonight, and we're happy to be here with Dr. David Delaney from the Mexican American Catholic College. He is the academic dean there, and maccsa.org is the website, www.maccsa.org. We are talking about marriage. We're talking about the problems of divorce and where we're at. We're going to get back to that in a second. But again, this is sponsored by the Pilgrim Center of Hope for Catholicism Live. Please get on their website, Pilgrim Center of Hope, all one word, .org. What's coming up? This Saturday, November 20th, at the Omni Hotel Ballroom is the prayer brunch to inspire and support. Patrick Madrid is coming in to speak. The topic is, Why Be Catholic when you could be anything else. What a wonderful time to spend a Saturday with the Pilgrim Center of Hope folks at the Omni Hotel, a beautiful place. The lunch is going to be good. Call 210-521-3377. That would be the Pilgrim Center of Hope at 210-521-3377, or visit their website, as we said, pilgrimcenterofhope.org. We covered quite a bit of material in the first part. We threw out several scripture verses there. We explained what they were. If you didn't catch those or didn't jot them down, please email us at live@catholic.org, and we will give you those scriptural references to have. And when we want to wrap this up, though, there's in Matthew it says, you will marry a divorced woman, or if you are divorced and marry another, you are committing adultery,
Right.
except. So the exception is kind of narrow in specific things. And carry on where we're at. Wrap this up a little bit, Dr. Lane, if you would, please.
Yes. So we identified at this point two possible interpretations, both of the patristic interpretation, suggesting that the divorce was allowed, referring to St. Paul's reference in 1 Corinthians 7,
Right.
that said that you could get this divorce because of unchastity, because of adultery, if you will, but you couldn't remarry.
Right.
The second one was the interpretation that's in the New American Bible, which interprets this term porneia
Right.
as an invalid marriage. And so in that case, it wouldn't be really a divorce.
Right.
So it
because
would
there
be an
was-
exception. The third possibility, which is an interesting one, which is really what the NAB used to use, and so they kind of changed it a little bit, is that, and I won't go into this in a lot of detail, but ultimately there was some belief that, or some scholars were saying, okay, well, this is a debate, or these Pharisees are coming up and asking Jesus to mediate between a debate between two great scholars of the law. One, Jewish scholars, Jewish rabbis, Hillel and Shammai.
Right.
And one of them said, and I have to admit here, I can't recall which is which. One of them is very rigorous in saying that this porneia was being interpreted, was the interpretation in, or the translation of the Hebrew erot dabar in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 1 through 4. This was an unclean thing. This was the exception that really Moses was pointing to, that you could divorce your wife for some unclean thing. One of them said that that this unclean thing was really restricted just to unchastity, or in other words, to adultery. Okay. The other said, well, no, anything is unclean. He went so far as to say, well, your wife could burn breakfast and you could have a new one for lunch. No. Ultimately,
Wow.
the net was cast very wide for him. And so they were saying, this interpretation says that it's being interpreted in such a way that's saying that this is another case. I'm not even going to address that issue, because I am saying here so that there is no such thing as divorce. And you can see that in Matthew 19. If we go back to looking at Matthew 19, look at the disciples' response. The disciples said to Jesus, if such is the case of a man with his wife, it is not expedient to marry. And so they're saying, Jesus at the very beginning said, no, Moses, there is no such thing as divorce. Moses just allowed you to have that. And so this exception here was the exception in the debate, between, at least on one side of it. But Jesus is saying, no, there is no exception. And that's why his disciples say, what? If that's the case, then it's probably better not to marry. And Jesus doesn't say no. He basically says, well, only a few people are called to that.
Right.
Only a few people are called to that charism of chastity, of celibacy for the sake of the kingdom. And then he goes into that discussion.
Right, and we can cover some of that in our later episodes as we'll talk about that.
Sure.
Works on. But the surprise of the disciples is probably our reaction today is saying, well, it's almost impossible to have a fruitful, loving, self-giving marriage to one person for the rest of your life.
Right.
Well, as a humans, yes, it is impossible, but nothing is impossible with God. And that's why it's so important in that marriage to work together.
And that's a very good point too, because notice that Moses, before the advent of grace, comes in and gives this concession. It is perhaps a human impossibility, but it isn't just a human possibility anymore. With the sacramental grace, it now becomes, with Christ, a possibility. And so that concession, that human concession of Moses, now has to be done away with. It now has to be clarified. That was a human concession that God allowed Moses to make, but that's not the way that it is. And that's not what it's going to be in my kingdom, in my church.
And the way Christ instituted marriage as his role model, as being married to his church, the bridegroom to the church. But we are in reality today, Dr. Delaney, and divorce is a problem. And in the Catholic Church and in non-Catholic Christian church and all over. But the Catholics, it appears, do they divorce as often and percentage-wise as anyone else? How does the statistics look?
Yeah, that's a very good question. It does very much look like Catholics reflect the general demographics of the the demographics of society. There is some hint, some suggestion, and it makes very much sense that the divorce rate might be lower among Catholics or those who practice natural family planning. There was a number that has been thrown out. The source of that, in the low, I think 2 or 3% for those practicing NFP. That number I've traced to to an unscientific poll, basically in the mid 1980s of a couple-to-couple league trainers. And so, in one sense, I mean, there is some suggestion there that that would be the case. These are people that take it very seriously. We know that it takes a lot of self-giving. Natural family planning is very beautiful, but it's not easy. It's very much hard training. It allows you to master yourself for the sake of the other. It forces communication. You end up learning much more about the other, and you're able to love the other more. And so you're much more committed to it. So it makes very much sense that that would be the case. But unfortunately, and it's very great unfortunately, that's not a large percentage of those who say that they're Catholic that practice natural family planning. And so by and large, those within the church, the Catholics within the church, experience divorce at basically the same percentage. That's another number that's very hard to nail down. But in general, we can say that it's somewhere between 40 and 50%. And it looks like if things continue as the way that they're going, that the divorce rate will probably increase for those that get married. But though we're seeing less and less, I mean, the numbers of marriages are declining as well.
And another skew of the statistics that I've looked up a little bit is multiple divorces are counted. So how do you delineate those? And that kind of mixes it in. What do we do about this? Well, one of the things, I think natural family planning is one tool taught prior to marriage as well as in marriage in order to get the couples to understand their bodies and their souls and how this works together and their commitment to each other, mainly in the communication-wise. That's one way. But society will say, well, shucks, why worry about marriage? Just cohabitate. And even maybe that's even a good way to practice first before you get married. Does that make sense? Does that turn out that way?
Alan, it seems to be very pragmatic, doesn't it? To pragmatic ears, well, we practice, we have football practice, we have scrimmages, why not with marriage? Well, it doesn't turn out to work that way. And we see problems with it as well. We know, let's revisit a second the purpose of marriage. The purpose of marriage, the reason that the state is involved in recognizing marriage is because the churches or the state has always recognized how important marriage is for the health of the state. Healthy families, healthy marriages lead to healthy families lead to healthy societies. And it's in the state's best interest for this healthy society. It's the foundation of society. Well, we have seen the dissolution of marriage come about with great increase in divorce rates, starting around in the 1960s, mid-1960s or so. It just so happens that's about 50 or 5 years after we see the advent of the pill that was allowed to be used in the United States, at least the precursor to the forerunner to the FDA, allowed it to be used. But within that, we start to see marriages coming apart, and there are very negative consequences to society because of this. If we see marriages coming apart, then society is going to start coming apart.
Right.
The divorce rate, one of the things I should mention as well that we see that happened with this increasing divorce rate is that marriage courts, family courts, civil courts started to become inundated with trying to adjudicate between two people presenting their cases, and it became very hard for them.
Right.
And so what did we come up with? No-fault divorces.
No fault. Like no-fault insurance, you can get a no-fault divorce.
Yes.
Almost that you pay your ticket and that's it. How easy way out. What?
And then
Not good.
and then divorce rate skyrockets.
Right.
With no-fault divorce. Right. That's probably one after artificial contraception. No-fault divorce is probably one of the worst things that has happened to our society.
Sure. That's allowed the folks to realize that, well, this is an option, and this is an easy option in order to not try to work together, to try to do other things together.
Yeah, and that was actually, no-fault divorce was kind of the thought behind the title of our show tonight.
Sure.
I do for a while.
Yeah, that's very good. Cohabitation, I had a little quick story, but that's okay. We'll wrap up there. Father Charlie, God rest his soul, I would talk about how can we help this cohabitation, because a lot of family members and a lot of things are doing that. Father Charlie had a house, and he had a basement with 2 rooms. This was in Bloomington, Indiana, in a college town. Well, you have students that before they are married, and they are still students in college. And so it makes sense because they can't they afford separate rent and things. So they would come to Father Charlie, said, "Are you living together?" And say, "Yes." "Okay, we will help that. You, son, you now have a room downstairs in my house. You will stay in my house. You could put it in there free of charge, and you can help her pay the bills there at her apartment. But this is where you can to stay apart for 6 months prior or to time until you get married." And what a beautiful gift that he gave to these young people. Now, and so maybe we could think about doing that if we know them. Instead of saying, "No, you can't do that. You've got to suffer and split." Say, "How about you could come and rent out my place for a minimal fee or whatever," and help those couples. He taught me a very great lesson there, and like I said, God rest his soul. So instead of just giving the negative part of it, try to help that a little bit.
Indeed.
The same thing with marriages. I mean, we have many, many people who have very, very good marriages.
Yeah.
And if they see other people struggling and having that, you have the power by your baptism to say, "Let's sit down and talk together." We don't do that very well, I don't think. I don't think that's encouraged very well. So if there's tidbits to help part of this going on, you can do that. And you think, "No, I can't talk to these folks. I don't know what to say." Well, don't worry what you say. Pray with them, and then God will give you what to say. So I'm just going to throw those little tidbits out as we go along here. The attitudes of cohabitation, of being there, just okay, I'll check this out before I play the big game. I want to practice a little bit. What does that lead to? What's the mentality of that a little bit that leads to?
Well, thanks, Alan, for bringing me back to to the original question.
That's okay.
Yes, I oftentimes have my difficulty find my way back.
But we'll
from
get
the
back.
rabbit
We'll
trail.
get back. Don't worry.
Okay, but we find, and it started, we see in a study back in the early 1980s in Sweden that looked at this exact issue, and how successful marriages were after cohabitation. At that time, they saw about an 80% divorce rate.
Wow.
For those who cohabitated before marriage. Since then, a lot of things have changed. Cohabitation has greatly increased.
Right.
There's a lot less societal, what's the word that I'm looking for? But basically, society makes it much easier.
Sure, society doesn't shun that anymore. It
Exactly.
It looks at it as part of what we're doing, and that's part of what we're talking about here. And unfortunately, we got to wrap up real quick here for a break. But we are against society by trying to maintain fidelity and maintain separateness and maintain our individuality prior to marriage and waiting to cohabitate till after we are married. That is we're swimming upstream. And so we as Catholics need to understand what marriage is, which we tried to explain, and try to know what the divorce rate is and all the pressures of these young folks and folks in there, and try to help them. And we're going to talk more about this. We'd love to have your questions and your comments. Call in at 210-734-5371. We need to go on a break now. We'll be right back. Thank you.
Now we know an unborn baby is a human life. See what we've been missing.
Attention youth and young adults of the Archdiocese of San Antonio. Did you know that November 30th will soon be upon us? So what, you say? November 30th is the deadline for your application to attend World Youth Day in Madrid, Spain, August 9th through the 22nd, 2011. Don't miss this amazing week-long spiritual journey, including prayer, song, sharing liturgy, and an unforgettable vigil and closing Mass with the Holy Father. Call 210-857-1037 or visit www.wydsa.com for more info.
The University of the Incarnate Word's annual Light the Way is moving to Benson Stadium. Join us with our friends from HEB Saturday, November 20th at 7:30 p.m. for our traditional kickoff to the holiday season. The university's Benson Stadium accommodates 6,000 guests, so everyone can be a part of the fun. We will have great music and a few surprises. We'll also collect new unwrapped toys for Elf Louise. Following the ceremony, join the candlelight procession through campus to HEB Central Market. For information, call 829-6001 or visit uiw.edu/lighttheway.
Welcome back. We're in Catholicism Live discussing marriage and I do for a while. And unfortunately in our society today, Catholics and non-Catholics choose that this is not for them in divorce. Mm-hmm. We are pretty much shocked by the statistics. We are trying to help this out and see what we can do. We've given some ideas and we'll do more. But what are some statistics again for those who are divorced and the breakout of the family is the breakdown of the marriage? It goes hand in hand. Let's discuss a couple of those things, Dr. Delaney. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, let me mention one more caveat about the cohabitation, that 80% rate.
Right.
A lot of things have happened since the early 1980s. Cohabitation is much greater. Some people are doing it primarily for economic means just before, after already having committed to marriage. And so the numbers have been skewed, but we still do see a much greater percentage. The National Marriage Project is a good resource to look at for statistics. And it still is very much higher. You still are betting against your marriage by cohabitating before the marriage. But what we see because of the divorce rate, well, first of all, divorce begets divorce. One of the things that we see is, and this was primarily with girls, there's a number, it's not as high, but it's considerable, but a girl whose parents divorce is 92% more likely to divorce herself, almost twice as likely to divorce herself as one whose parents do not divorce. And it becomes perpetuating. Part of the reason for that is that what we learn in marriage, what we learn in the family, the children plug in really to the relationship that the parents have with one another.
Right.
You know, we've heard the old adage that the best thing you can do for your children in your marriage is to love your spouse.
Yes.
It's not the same as the father loving the child and the mother loving the child in these individual relationships. There's something alive, there's something real about the relationship between the parents that the child plugs into. That is almost a nurturing womb of trust, I think we've said before. If the people that the children learn to trust most can't be trusted to be committed to what they recognize is supposed to be a lifelong relationship, well then who can?
Right.
If they can't learn commitment in their families, then they can't live that commitment out themselves.
Sure.
This and the increase in premarital sex actually does great damage to this as well. We find commitment, especially among boys.
Right.
One of the great damages that is done to boys that are in promiscuous lifestyles is their inability to form lasting bonds, their inability to stay committed to relationships.
Wow.
And so we see society falling apart. We see today 1 out of every 2 children will go into bed in a child without their biological father present. And this is because most of this happens because of divorce.
Sure.
But one of the reasons for this is ultimately that the biological father is no longer there. There's a lot of desertion too,
Right.
but it's primarily divorce.
And a lot of things I think our society teaches us as adults to do your own thing. You have to be personally happy, to strive to make sure that self-fulfillment comes first, when really the children are really the ones that suffer.
They are.
They forget about the rights of children. Children have a right. Children have a right to have a biological mother and father who loves them.
That's exactly
Children,
right.
as they grow up, boys will understand how to love ladies before, at, and after marriage by watching their dad and mom.
Yes.
Women will know how to love their spouses by watching that. And so you're right, as you said, if that is fractured, how does that child learn? Well, that's okay.
Hollywood.
Kids, they don't learn. That's
Right.
and so that's why it's self-perpetuating, as you said. Too many, I think, see the divorce, the no-fault divorce, and they'll say, well, the children will adapt. They'll be adaptable. They'll understand their life cycle, that every other weekend's with dad, and then the rest is with mom, and children don't understand that. And we don't understand the scars for that and don't see it till later on. So one of the things that I guess we could help, again, to give some tidbits to help, is if you see a couple that are having trouble and maybe reaching out and you can reach to them, sit down with them with their children to discuss. Because I think when adults have trouble, they don't want to talk in front of their children. And maybe with a help of another couple or help of an older couple or an older married couple to say, let's sit down with your children to discuss, hey, what's going on here a little bit. Try to support that family and help that family in a little bit. And again, we're trying to say the church says, do not divorce. But then there are some circumstances, of course, I guess we could come up with domestic violence and abuse. Mm-hmm. The church has never said to you must stay with an abusive relationship. Then there's a time to separate. But those are fairly extreme cases. I think we are seeing this on my feelings are hurt or whatever, that whatever reason's there. But as we see the divorce, as we see going on, and our next episode we're going to explain this a little bit further. We're going to go into almost a free fall type discussion on divorce. But where can we get help? Yes. Where can we get a look in there? What are in place? What is our church doing to try to support the divorced couples or to try to save the marriages possibly?
Yeah. Well, the USCCB has recognized that that marriage is in crisis, family is in crisis, and they've developed a marriage project, a national marriage initiative.
Right.
They have a website called foryourmarriage.org with a lot of resources associated with helping to not only to come to understand the Catholic teaching on marriage, which, as we pointed out at the very beginning, I think we pointed out the last few weeks, is woefully misunderstood or not being either taught or received. This helps with not just, though, the theoretical, but the practical. A lot of practical advice, a lot of practical things that one can do to nourish good and healthy marriages, but also resources for marriages that are having difficulty or may already be in crisis. We've mentioned other resources, other apostolates. Some apostolates that are very important to know about is the Alexander House, which is a national apostolate, but we're very blessed to have it here locally.
Yes, Greg and Julie are wonderful, wonderful people. And their website is www.thealexanderhouse.org. And so it's all one word, The Alexander House. Beautiful, beautiful.
It is. There's another that actually has its roots. It's called Retrovi. It has its roots back ultimately in Cursillo, but it through the
marriage encounter, right?
Right, the marriage encounter weekends. And Retrovi is also, many couples find it very successful for them. I believe that they have a number that they use, a success rate around 80% or something in that range.
Now there is a website for Retrovi. You got to know how to spell it though, so it's a little bit different spelling. But the easier way is to go on the Archdiocese website.
Yes.
archsa.org, and our Archdiocese website under Family and Marriage, the section of that, and then you will see where the help of, we have Retrovi weekends scheduled here in the Archdiocese. I think there's 5 or 6 set up. It's a weekend, and then it's follow-up workshops. And it's focused on the couple. It's not group therapy and group sessions. It's focused on the couple. Marriage Encounter are for good marriages, to make good marriages better. And again, to be that shining example. We all could use some help. I know I need some help being a better husband. And no matter how long we've been married, we could still work on that and to do that. So if we recognize that, and in evangelization of our own, as I've talked about before, of those of us who've been blessed, and I have been truly blessed by a wonderful spouse who has hung on to me for 33 and a half years, praise God for that. And so to help us to be role models for others. Not that we're perfect, not that we don't have problems, not that we don't carry our crosses, but we do that.
I'm glad you mentioned evangelization, Alan, too, because something that's very important that we don't realize is the key to a successful marriage is to have the couples as holy as possible.
Right.
The holiness is the only salvation for our fallenness, for overcoming our fallen inclinations to selfishness. Most Catholics, sad to say, don't recognize that, first of all, their mission is to become a saint, and to help their spouse, not to help their spouse become holy as well, but that there is real help in the sacraments, that they cooperate with the grace in the sacraments. They have many Catholics don't recognize the reason that they receive the sacraments is for this supernatural infusion of God's life that give them the strength to do things that they can't do naturally. This is something that we need a new evangelization in that regard, with a new catechesis as well.
Right. And that marriage is not just the wedding ceremony as the marriage sacrament. That marriage sacrament continues on throughout your life as you live with your spouse and continue on with your spouse. Wow, very, very good. One other website I'll put out there, we may talk more of this next time, www.exceptionalmarriages.com. If you listen to 89.7 FM, and especially from 11 to 12 most days, you'll hear the Popcheks there discussing, Dr. Popchek, and that's where they do the heart, mind, and soul. And they all use their website, exceptionalmarriages.com. A lot of information there, and a lot of tidbits to go that. We're moving along very fast. We'll have to, here's a saint of the week. We'll talk to St. Elizabeth of Hungary, who is the saint of today. Today is her feast day. And very well picked here because of her marriage. She was betrothed at 4 years old and was married at 14 years old. She was in Hungary. She had 3 children by the time she was 20. Her husband was off on a crusade and died on a crusade. And a couple of weeks later, her 3rd child was born. And so she now was the Queen of Hungary. Became very, very involved with the poor. So through her marriage with her husband and fruitful children, still took time. At the time, she built a hospital with 28 beds, visited the inmates daily, and at the same time aided 900 poor people daily. This is quite a woman at 20 years old with 3 small children whose husband just died on a crusade. What an inspiration for us. And as you mentioned earlier on, she knew St. Francis of Assisi, and she knew his heart and his care for the poor, and she continued on. She died at a very young age, 24 years old, died 4 years later. Probably, and worked from all of her charitable labors, all of the work that she had done. But because in that short life she carried on the fruitfulness of marriage and the sanctity of her marriage and through her children, she was canonized in 1235. Simply 7 years after she had passed away was canonized. And canonized as the greatest woman of the German Middle Ages, St. Elizabeth of Hungary. What a role model that we could learn here from a young lady that understood what that was. Our pearl of the week. Our pearl of the week is 3 to Get Married by Archbishop Fulton Sheen. We have probably about 1 minute to go. Dr. Delaney, if you could talk a little bit about the pearl of the week from Archbishop Fulton Sheen, go right ahead.
Yes, as we know, Archbishop Fulton Sheen, whose cause for canonization actually is in Rome now.
Wow,
I was
very
fortunate
good.
enough to be involved in that when I was living in Champaign. I was one of the censor laborum, reading through his books as part of that process.
Wonderful.
And so I have a very close attachment in reading through a lot of his works. 3 to Get Married, of course, we know that's a play on the old phrase.
Right.
You know, 1 for the money, 2 for the show,
Right.
3 to get married. But what we're talking about is that if God, and we've said this many times, but if God is not at the center of your marriage, then your chances for a successful marriage, especially in today's society, it was bad at the time you wrote the book, it's
Right.
much worse today.
Sure, so
And
the 3 being the 2, the husband, the wife, the spouse, and God. Okay,
yes.
as we work that. And unfortunately, we've got to get the advertisement. And please give the Pilgrim Center of Hope a call at 210-521-3377. Support them and be at the Omni Hotel November 20th. Please call them for reservations or get on the website right now at Pilgrim Center of Hope. That's one word, pilgrimcenterofhope.org. And make sure that you go to the Omni Hotel this Saturday for lunch and hear Patrick Madrid talk about why be Catholic when you could be anything else. Wow, tonight flew by, Dr. Delaney. This has been wonderful. We will be back. We'll take a break next week. We wish you a very, very happy Thanksgiving. And please, we will pray for your safety, those who are traveling, and those of your family members who are traveling to see you over Thanksgiving. We're completing episode 4. We're looking for 4 more episodes of this series of sex and contemporary culture. This is Catholicism Live. Keep us in your prayers, and we'll keep you in our prayers. Have a happy Thanksgiving, and we'll see you in 2 weeks. May God bless you. Thank you.
This is today's Catholic Television on Catholic Television of San Antonio. This is the television program of the Archdiocese newspaper of record, Today's Catholic. I'm Deacon Pat Rogers, and that's Father John Lias of St. Mary's University Theology Department. And we're here to talk about the various issues that have underneath them a moral component that will be of interest or concern to we Catholics. And oftentimes people are reading headlines or hearing about them on radio or television and don't make